Hi Year 9, here is your second lesson on and in spectacles. Don't worry, no YouTube clips with no sound in this video. That was obviously me trying to be too technologically advanced. So, industrialisation then. How did Dickens feel about industrialisation? Think about what industrialisation was. How did Dickens feel about it? Our new word today is prosperous. And think back to the little extracts we did on A Christmas Carol earlier in the year. How was Scrooge presented as prosperous? And then I want to aim higher question. Think back to when we looked at William Blake, if you can remember. This is, asked me to do some recall. William Blake is the one that wrote London that we did, the chimney sweeper. So why were poets like William Blake, or romantic poets, and writers like Charles Dickens so against industrialisation? So you can pause the video and make some notes. I'll just let you see what prosperous means. If someone's prosperous, they are successful in material terms, so they're flourishing financially. So someone that is very successful, someone that has a lot of money. Okay, so you can pause the video and have a go at answering those questions independently. So industrialisation was the rise of factories and therefore means of mass production throughout the 19th century, and it obviously changed 19th century society and 20th and 21st century society dramatically. It meant that the divide between the rich and the poor was much bigger. It meant that a lot of the poor were the ones working in the factories, being exploited by the sort of capitalist factory owners. The conditions in the factories were horrendous. Often children worked in factories, and remember Dickens himself worked in a factory blackening bottles, which is a really key thing to understanding why Dickens felt so negatively about the Industrial Revolution, and he believed that it caused society a lot of harm and a lot of ill. So as we've said, if someone's prosperous, then they're successful. Scrooge is presented as prosperous because he is a business owner, he's a money lender, and he's obviously made, Scrooge makes his own wealth as well. That wealth wasn't given to him, that was him as a business owner. So William Blake, or the Romantic Poets, and there are many 5 romantic poems in your GCSE anthology that we'll be looking at in September as well, and a little bit later on in the summer term. So William Blake was a romantic poet. So he and Charles Dickens were so against industrialisation because of the effect that it had on nature and the natural world, the romantic poets particularly, but also because they felt that the Industrial Revolution was essentially evil, and it was causing all the evils in society to be more pronounced and more obvious, such as social inequality and child labour. So our knowledge goal today is to explain how Priestley uses language to create our first impressions of the Birling family and Gerald. So we're going to revise how Priestley uses his views on capitalism and socialism and how they're presented through the opening stage directions, which is what we're going to read today. How Priestley uses language to give the audience their first impressions of the characters, the Birling family and Gerald, and why Priestley chooses to give us these first impressions of these characters. Now, when you read any text at any level, it's really important to think, why does the writer want me to have that impression of that character? And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So we're going to read together the opening stage directions, and I want you to think about, how does Priestley represent capitalism through the opening stage directions? Focus on the description of the Birling family's wealth, Mr. Birling's job, the head of the family, and the impression he gives us of the family and Gerald as a whole. Okay, so a just challenge question you might want to think about: if the Birling family are presented as a capitalist family, how do you think Priestley is going to want his audience to feel about them? So think about how Priestley felt about capitalism. If he's presenting us as this capitalist family, how is he going to want us to feel about them? So we're going to read the opening stage directions, and we're going to make some notes on any references to capitalism. And there are some words here which you may just want to have a quick read through, just to help you with some of the vocabulary that we're going to come up with here, okay? But I'll talk you through it as well. Okay, So this is the opening stage directions. The dining room is of a fairly large suburban house belonging to a prosperous manufacturer. So we learn some important things here. Their house is large, a sign of wealth. It's a suburban house. Now the suburbs are on the outskirts of a town. So as we learned in the context video yesterday, the Birlings live on the edge of Brumley, which is a town that has a lot of factories. Okay, so they're rich. They don't live in the smog-filled, pollution-filled town, busy town. They live on the outskirts in a large house. So the house belongs to a prosperous, a successful manufacturer, a business owner. So the head of the family, Arthur Birling, as we're going to find out in a minute, is a successful factory owner, and therefore he is a capitalist. It's important to make those notes. It has a good solid furniture of the period, so their furniture is good and solid, therefore it's expensive, it's well made, another sign of their wealth. The general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cosy and homelike. Now this is really important because there's some foreshadowing going on here. Now remember, foreshadowing is when a writer hints at something that's going to happen in the future of the text. So the whole effect of their house, if you walked in, would be quite impressive. It's fancy, it's got nice furniture, it seems a very comfortable place to live, but it's not cosy, it's not homelike. And we'll see as we read the play that this idea of the house looking very nice on the outside, but not actually being a loving, cosy place to live, symbolises the Birling family themselves. On the outside, they look like the perfect sort of wealthy family, but beneath the surface, there are lots of issues there. So in the actual version, if you're following, if you've got your own version, you'll see that there's a big old paragraph which are stage directions about the set. We're going to actually look at those in a separate lesson, okay? So we're skipping a little bit. At rise of curtain, the four Birlings and Gerald are seated at the table, with Arthur Birling at one end, his wife at the other. Eric is downstage, and Sheila and Gerald seated upstage. Edna, the parlour maid, so they have a maid, therefore rich, is just clearing the table, which has no cloth, of the dessert plates and champagne glasses, etc., and replacing them with a decanter of port, a cigar box and cigarettes. Port glasses are already on the table, and all five are in evening dress of the period, the men in tails and white ties, and not dinner jackets. So, they have a maid, sign of wealth. They've obviously just been having a nice fancy meal. They've got dessert, champagne glasses, port, cigars, cigarettes, all signs of wealth. They're in evening dress, men in tails and white ties, not dinner jackets. So they're in expensive, nicely made clothes. So Priestley wants the audience to realise the minute that the curtains open, that they see the stage, they see the characters and what they're wearing, they see what's on the table, they see the glasses that they're drinking out of. This is a family that have money. And the head of this family is a capitalist. He has his money because he is a factory owner. And if he is a factory owner, then he has factory workers. And we can imagine what life is like for those working class factory owners. Think in 1912, what did we learn about what life was like for those people? It was not very pleasant. And who is the one sitting there nice and cosy in their nice house? Mr. Birling, at the expense of those people that work in his factory. So we can see how Priestley is beginning to bring in some of his beliefs here. So we're just going to go back before we read the next paragraph. Think about the references to capitalism. Think about the description of the house, okay? So now we're going to read about the actual characters, okay? And in a minute, we're going to think about what these quotations reveal about the family. So he goes through one character at a time, and these are really important because this is the information that he wants us to know about the characters before they speak on stage. Arthur Birling is a heavy-looking, rather pretentious man in his middle 50s. Now, heavy-looking means he's overweight, but being overweight in those days was a sign, again, of wealth. You had enough to eat. Now, portentous, if we go back to our vocabulary, portentous, someone who thinks they're very knowledgeable about the present and the future and likes to give their opinion of this a lot. So Mr. Birling is a bit of a know-it-all. He thinks that he has lots of good advice, lots of insight and knowledge about things, and he likes to give all that information to people. Okay, he loves the sound of his own voice. So he's in his mid-50s with fairly easy manners, but rather provincial in his speech. Now, being rather provincial in his speech means that he likes to talk a lot, basically, if we go back to provincial. He is small-minded and unsophisticated. He only knows his own narrow experiences. Now, this idea of being unsophisticated is really important, actually, because what we're also told is that he has fairly easy manners, okay? Now, we're going to just come back to that in a minute when we read about Mrs. Birling. So what I'd like you to do is just record in your books, write Arthur Birling down, and just pause the video and just write down a couple of quotations for his character. So it might be heavy looking, portentous, provincial in his speech. Okay, so just write down a couple of quotations for Arthur Birling. Okay, so pause the video and do that, and we're going to come back to those in a minute. Okay, so once you've written down your quotations, let's look at Sybil Birling, Mrs. Birling. Okay, so Mrs. Birling, or her name is Sybil. His wife is about 50, a rather cold woman. Now, he means emotionally cold and distant. Okay, so if someone's emotionally cold, then they're quite unpleasant, they're unfeeling, they're unemotional. She's also similar age to her husband, about 50, and her husband's social superior. Now, that is really, really, really important. We're going to talk in our next lesson a little bit more about social class, but Mrs. Birling is from a higher or more superior family social class than her husband. So Mrs. Birling has married beneath her class. And this could link back to the fact that Mr. Birling has fairly easy manners. So he is not as well brought up, he's not as well mannered, as sophisticated as his wife. And that is really important. So again, write down Mrs. Birling or Sybil Birling and a couple of quotations, maybe a cold woman and husband's social superior. Okay, so pause the video while you do that. So Sheila Birling is their daughter. Sheila is a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited. So Sheila's pretty. Now, remember, we are living in 1912 in a society where women are considered second-class citizens, where a wealthy woman's job is essentially to look pretty, wear nice clothes, and catch a rich husband. So, you know, it's to Sheila's advantage that she's pretty. She's in her early 20s, pleased with life and rather excited. Well, again, of course, she's pleased with life. She never would have had to work a day in her life and would have had everything given to her. So she's rather pleased with life and excitable. So she comes across as a little bit silly, really. So again, pause the video and write down a couple of quotations about Sheila. Maybe the fact that she's pretty and rather excited. Okay, so pause the video and write down some quotations for Sheila. So Gerald then, Gerald Croft. He's the other character sitting around the table, not related to the Birling family. He has a different surname. He's an attractive chap, so he's good looking, about 30, so a little bit older than Sheila, rather too manly to be a dandy. Now, we're just going to again go back to our vocabulary. A dandy, a man who is very concerned with his appearance and sort of the way that he looks. Now, dandy comes from a really fabulous group of people, the decadents or the decadence poets. Think about people like Oscar Wilde, for example, who unfortunately the decadent poets were up to all sorts of no good business that's not really appropriate to study them for GCSE, but they're a fascinating, really fascinating group of people. So this idea of a dandy sort of came from talking about people like that, really. So, you know, he's not it's not like he's overly obsessed with his appearance, but, you know, he's handsome, well dressed and well presented. and very much the well-bred young man about town. So, you know, Gerald Croft is a catch. He is well-bred, he is handsome, he is well-dressed, and he's got a good reputation in the town. So again, pause the video and make some notes on those quotations about Gerald. And finally, we have Eric Birling, Sheila's brother and Mr. and Mrs. Birling's son. So Eric is in his early 20s, not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. Now, this is probably the most difficult explanation of a character to really understand. If you're not quite at ease, he's not comfortable in himself, and he's sort of shy, but also assertive, outgoing as well. So it's almost like Eric he's not really comfortable in his own skin. He doesn't really know who he is or his place in the world. Now, what's quite interesting to consider about Eric is that Eric is Mr. Birling's heir. So if Mr. Birling's a successful factory owner, Eric will inherit that from his father. So maybe he's not quite at ease because he's never really had to make his own way in the world, and he's aware that everything he's ever had has been given to him. So Eric's quite an interesting character, really. So again, pause the video and jot down some notes on Eric. At the moment, they've all had a good dinner and are celebrating. They're celebrating the occasion and are pleased with themselves. So hopefully what you now have in your book is you have got some quotations. Now what I would like you to do is I would like you to explode those quotations. So let's look at Mrs. Birling, for example, rather cold woman. You might underline the word cold, do a little arrow and write she's emotionally cold and distant. And if you then would do her husband's social superior, you talk about how she's obviously from a higher social class or a higher status family. And again, why does Priestley want us to know this? So if you want to challenge yourself or you're quite confident in doing this, you might want to start to try and link some of the character descriptions to Priestley's views on capitalism and socialism, Priestley's intentions. So you should have a couple of quotations written down for each character. So you should have Mr. Birling, Mrs. Birling, Sheila, Gerald Croft and Eric Birling. Look at the quotations you've written down, underline the key words and just make some notes. What do you learn about these characters from the description? And if you want to push yourself further, you could start trying to link these to capitalism and socialism and Priestley's beliefs. So finally then, we've just got our final feedback. So how is Mr. Birling presented as an industrialist in the opening stage directions? And how are the Birling family and Gerald presented as prosperous in the opening stage directions? Okay, so think about that Mr. Birling is a factory owner. Think about all of the descriptions of wealth. Okay, well done, and I will see you in your next lesson.